There are places on this earth where the ground beneath your feet remembers, where the stones hold a weight that is more than geological, more than the simple accumulation of millennia. These are the borderlands, not marked on any modern map, but felt in the marrow of your bones when you stand upon them. The Caucasus Mountains are such a place. They rise like the broken teeth of some primordial giant, their peaks scraping the belly of the sky, their roots plunging so deep into the earth that no drill, no probe, no instrument of modern science has ever truly reached their foundation. These are not merely mountains, they are a scar, a monument, a prison, and beneath them, in chambers of stone so ancient that they were old when humanity first learned to speak, something waits. The shepherds who graze their flocks on the high meadows know this. They will not speak of it to outsiders, but among themselves, in the old languages that predate the empires, they whisper. They tell their children not to venture too close to certain caves, not to drink from certain springs. They point to the great peak of Elbrus, that twin-headed sentinel of ice and stone, and they say that it is not a mountain at all. It is a seal, a lid placed over a chasm by powers so vast and so terrible that even the gods themselves feared what lay beneath. This is not a story of heroes and quests. This is not a tale of monsters defeated and treasures won. This is the story of what came before. Before the gods who would later sit in marble temples and demand the blood of bulls. Before the heroes whose names would be sung in epic verse. Before humanity itself learned to stand upright and look at the stars with longing. This is the story of the first children of creation. The beings who were born not from the womb of a goddess, but from the raw, churning chaos of a universe still learning its own laws. They were the Titans, they were the firstborn, and they did not go gently into the pages of forgotten mythology. They were buried alive. To find them, to understand what they were and what they may yet become, we must ourselves become travelers in time. We must descend through the layers of history and myth, through the civilizations that rose and fell in the shadow of these mountains, through the songs of poets and the prayers of priests, down, down into the deepest, darkest foundation of human memory. We must journey to the place where mythology and geology become one, to the threshold of the abyss. Our journey into the forgotten prison begins now. Long before the first city was built, before the first field was plowed, before the very concept of civilization had taken root in the human mind, the world was young. And in that youth, it was a place of raw, unfiltered power. The Greeks, who would later come to dominate the intellectual landscape of the ancient world, had a word for this primordial state. They called it chaos. But this was not chaos in the modern sense, not simply disorder or confusion. Chaos was a living, breathing void. It was the yawning gap, the infinite abyss from which all things emerged. It was not empty. It was pregnant with every possibility, every form, every being that would ever exist, all compressed into a single, seething, undifferentiated mass.
From this chaos, the first generation of powers came into being. They were not created by a benevolent deity. They were not shaped by a loving hand. They simply were. They condensed out of the primal void like drops of water forming from a cloud. These were the Protogenoi, the firstborn gods, the fundamental principles of existence given form and consciousness. Gaia, the earth herself, vast and nurturing, the mother of all life. Uranos, the sky, a great arching dome of stars and wind, Tartaros, the deep, the lightless pit that lay beneath even the roots of the world. Eros, not the chuggy cherub of later art, but a primordial force of attraction and creation, the power that bound all things together. And from their unions, from the mingling of earth and sky, light and dark, came the next generation, the Titans. The Titans were beings of a scale and a power that is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. They were not gods in the way we have come to understand the term. They were more fundamental than that. They were the living embodiments of the world's essential forces. Oceanos was not merely a god of the sea. He was the great river that encircled the entire world, the source of all fresh water, all life. Hyperion was not just a sun god. He was the light of heaven itself, the fire that brought illumination and clarity. Iapetus was the pillar of mortality, the father of all the races of men. Each Titan was a world unto themselves, a vast cosmic principle given shape, will, and ambition. They were ruled in those early days by Cronus, the youngest and most cunning of the first generation of Titans. His very name, derived from the word for time, speaks to his nature. He was not just a king. He was the inevitable march of the ages, the devourer of all things, the force that ground even mountains to dust. And his rule, though absolute, was built on a foundation of terrible violence. For Cronus had overthrown his own father, Ouranos, in an act of primal rebellion. He had taken a great sickle of adamantine, a metal harder than diamond, and at the urging of his mother Gaia, he had castrated the sky, severing heaven from earth, creating the space in which the world as we know it could exist. This act, brutal and necessary, was the first great crime of the cosmos, and it set in motion a cycle of violence, of fathers and sons, of old powers overthrown by new, that would define the entire mythology of the ancient world. For a time, an age beyond reckoning, the Titans ruled in unchallenged supremacy. Theirs was the Golden Age, a time before death, before suffering, before the countless sorrows that would later define the human condition. But their reign, like all things, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. For Cronus, haunted by a prophecy that he too would be overthrown by his own children, began to devour them. One by one, as his wife Rhea gave birth, he swallowed his offspring whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, all were consumed, imprisoned in the darkness of their father's belly. But Rhea, in her grief and cunning, saved one, the youngest, Zeus. Zeus was raised in secret, far from his father's sight, in a cave on the island of Crete. And when he came of age, he returned to challenge the old order. What followed was a war of such magnitude that it shook the very foundations of existence. It was the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. For 10 long years, the universe itself became a battlefield. On one side, the Titans, led by Kronos, fighting to preserve their ancient dominion. On the other, the Olympians, the younger gods, led by Zeus, fighting for a new order, a new age. The war was not fought with swords and spears alone. It was a war of cosmic forces. Mountains were hurled like stones. The seas boiled. The very fabric of reality was torn and mended 1,000 times. Zeus wielded the thunderbolt, a weapon forged in the depths of the earth by the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants whom Zeus had freed from their own imprisonment. Its power was absolute. Where it struck, matter itself was annihilated. But even with such a weapon, the war hung in the balance. The Titans were ancient, powerful, and they fought with the desperate fury of a people who knew they were facing extinction. It was only when Zeus descended into the deepest pit of Tartarus itself and freed another imprisoned race that the tide of the war finally turned. These were the Hecatonchires, the hundred-handed ones, beings of such monstrous power and appearance that even the Titans had feared them and locked them away. Each had 100 arms and 50 heads, and when they entered the battle, they fought with a fury that was unstoppable. They seized entire mountains and hurled them at the Titan forces. They grabbed boulders by the hundred and launched them in a ceaseless barrage that blotted out the sun. The Titans, for all their power, could not withstand such an assault. The war ended with the defeat of the Titans. But Zeus, unlike his father and grandfather before him, did not kill his enemies. Perhaps he knew that to kill such fundamental forces would unravel the world itself. Perhaps he understood that the Titans were not evil, merely old, and that their power was too great to simply erase. Whatever his reasoning, he chose a different punishment, a prison. And the prison he chose was Tartarus, that lightless abyss that lay as far below the earth as the sky lay above it. It would take an anvil 9 days to fall from heaven to earth, the poet said, and another 9 days to fall from earth to Tartarus. And there, in that ultimate depth, the Titans were cast down. But the myth, as it has been told and retold in the marble halls of Athens and the scrolls of Alexandria, is not the whole story. It is the victor's account, the sanitized, simplified version designed to glorify the Olympians and justify their rule. For the war did not end cleanly. The imprisonment was not complete. And the place where the final desperate battles were fought, the place where the last of the Titans were driven into the earth and sealed beneath stone, was not some abstract mythological underworld. It was here, the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus has always been a place of boundaries, a threshold between worlds. It stands at the crossroads of continents, where Europe meets Asia, where the civilizations of the Mediterranean met the vast, unknowable steppe. The ancient Greeks knew this. They called the Caucasus the end of the world, the limit of their maps. Beyond it lay only mystery, danger, and the realm of the gods. And it was here, in this liminal, sacred landscape, that the most powerful and dangerous of the Titans were buried.
The myths whisper of this. In the fragmentary verses of poets whose works survive only in scattered quotations, in the obscure commentaries of late Roman scholars, we find hints. Prometheus, the Titan who defied Zeus and gave fire to humanity, was chained to a peak in the Caucasus, his liver devoured daily by an eagle. This is the most famous story, the one that survived. But Prometheus was not alone. The text, known as the Prometheus Bound, attributed to Aeschylus, speaks of Typhon, the last and most terrible of the primordial monsters, being crushed beneath Mount Etna. But earlier, stranger sources place him elsewhere. They say he was born in the caves of the Caucasus, that his final battle with Zeus raged across these peaks, and that when he was defeated, he was not cast into Tartarus with the other Titans, but buried here, sealed beneath the mountains themselves. And there are others, names that have faded from memory, beings whose stories were too dangerous, too unsettling, to be preserved in the sanitized mythologies that were taught to children in the classical world. The Armenians, the Georgians, the countless tribes and peoples who have lived in the shadow of the Caucasus for millennia, they remember what the Greeks forgot. They speak of the Dev, the demonic giants who dwell beneath the mountains. They tell of Amirani, the culture hero who, like Prometheus, is chained to a peak, struggling forever against his bonds. They describe vast caverns where the old gods sleep, their breath causing earthquakes, their dreams shaping the fate of the world above. These are not separate mythologies. They are echoes of the same ancient truth. The Caucasus is not just a mountain range. It is a tomb, a prison, a seal, and what lies beneath it is not dead. It is waiting. To understand the nature of the prisoners, we must first understand what a Titan truly was. In the sanitized, marble-columned mythology of classical Greece, the Titans are often portrayed as simply an earlier generation of gods, powerful but ultimately defeatable, replaced by the more civilized, more human Olympians. But this is a profound simplification. The Titans were not gods in the way Zeus and Apollo were gods. They were something far older, far stranger, and far more fundamental. The Titans were the children of the earth and sky, born from the union of primal matter and infinite space. They did not rule over aspects of existence. They were those aspects. Oceanus was not a god who controlled the waters. He was the water itself, every drop of it, a single vast consciousness that encircled the world. Hyperion was not a deity who drove the chariot of the sun. He was light itself, the principle of illumination, of seeing and being seen. The Titans were the universe's first attempt at self-awareness. They were cosmic forces that had developed will, desire, and ambition. And that ambition, unchecked by the later concepts of morality and law that the Olympians would claim to represent, made them terrifyingly dangerous.
There was no malice in them, not in the way we understand the term. A hurricane is not evil. An earthquake does not sin. The Titans operated on a scale so vast that individual human lives, individual mortal civilizations, were as beneath their notice as the lives of ants are beneath ours. When they moved, worlds trembled. When they fought, existence itself was the battlefield. The war between the Titans and the Olympians was not a war of right versus wrong. It was a war between the old way and the new, between a cosmos governed by raw power and one governed, however imperfectly, by law. The Titans who were sealed beneath the Caucasus were not the weakest of their kind. They were the most dangerous, the most powerful, the ones who could not be allowed to remain free, even in the distant depths of Tartarus. For Tartarus, that lightless pit at the bottom of the world, was itself a living thing, a conscious void. And there was always the risk, however small, that the Titans imprisoned there might find a way to bend it to their will, to corrupt it, to turn their prison into a fortress from which they could launch a new rebellion. And so, Zeus, in his cold wisdom, made a second prison, one that was not in the underworld, but in the world itself, a prison of stone and ice, of weight and darkness, sealed by magic so old and so powerful that even the gods themselves could not fully understand it. The oldest prisoner, the one whose name has been almost entirely erased from the surviving texts, is sometimes called Atlas. But this is not the Atlas of the famous story, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders. That Atlas was punished with eternal labor, but he was free to stand, to think, to watch the stars turn above him. The Atlas of the Caucasus knew no such mercy. He was the firstborn son of Iapetus, the brother of Prometheus, and in the war he was the strategist, the general of the Titan forces. It was his cunning that prolonged the conflict for 10 years. It was his plans that nearly brought Zeus to his knees. And when the war was lost, Zeus understood that such a mind, such a will, could never be allowed even the freedom of Tartarus. And so Atlas was taken to the Caucasus, to a cavern so deep that no light had ever touched it. And there he was bound, not with chains, but with the very structure of the mountain itself. Stone grew through him, fusing with his flesh, his bones, his essence. He became a pillar, a foundation upon which the entire mountain range rested. Every gram of stone, every glacier, every peak was his burden. And unlike the Atlas of the sky, he could not stand, could not shift his weight, could not even close his eyes. He was made a part of the mountain, conscious, aware, feeling the weight of ages pressing down upon him with every passing second. His punishment was not labor. It was to be buried alive in his own body, to become the foundation of the world's greatest prison, forever.
And he was not alone. The second prisoner, and perhaps the most terrifying, was Typhon. In the later myths, Typhon is described as a monster, a creature of pure destruction, born from the rage of Gaia after the defeat of her Titan children. He is said to have had 100 dragon heads, each breathing fire, and a body so vast that his head scraped the stars. He was the storm made flesh, the embodiment of every destructive force in nature. Zeus fought him in a battle that lasted for days, a conflict so violent that it reshaped the geography of the entire eastern Mediterranean. And when Typhon was finally defeated, Zeus buried him, some say beneath Mount Etna in Sicily. But the older sources, the ones that the classical Greeks chose to forget, say otherwise. They say that Typhon was not born after the Titanomachy. He was a Titan himself, the youngest and most monstrous son of Gaia and Tartaros, a being of such primal chaos that even his fellow Titans feared him. And when he was defeated, he was not placed in Tartaros, for Tartaros was his father, and there was a risk he could draw power from that connection. Instead, he was taken to the Caucasus, to a chasm so deep it seemed to reach the very heart of the world, and there he was cast down. The chasm was then sealed, not with stone, but with ice. The peak of Elbrus, that twin-headed colossus of frozen snow, is not a natural formation. It is a cap, a plug of ice, so ancient and so cold that it has never melted, not even in the hottest summers, not even when the surrounding land burns with drought. Beneath it, in a prison of his own making, Typhon dreams, and his dreams are hurricanes. His breath is the earthquake. His rage, barely contained, is the volcano. The people of the Caucasus know this. When Elbrus trembles, when the ground shakes and the glaciers crack, they do not speak of tectonic plates or geological processes. They say that Typhon is stirring. They say that the chains are weakening, and they pray that he does not wake. The third great prisoner is the one whose story has survived most clearly in myth, though even it has been sanitized, turned into a tale of noble suffering rather than the horror it truly was. Prometheus, the Titan whose name means forethought, the one who sided with Zeus in the war and helped secure victory for the Olympians.
his gift to humanity, the stolen fire that he took from the forge of Hephaestus and delivered to the shivering mortals below, is celebrated as an act of compassion. But the punishment he received for that act speaks to a darker truth. Prometheus was chained to a peak in the Caucasus, and every day an eagle, the sacred bird of Zeus, would descend and tear out his liver. And every night, because he was immortal, the liver would regenerate and the torment would begin anew. This went on for thousands of years, until the hero Heracles, in his wanderings, finally shot the eagle and freed the Titan. This is the story as it is told, but there are fragments, older fragments, that tell a different tale. They say that Prometheus was not chained as a punishment, he was chained as a god, that his suffering was not arbitrary cruelty, but a necessity. For Prometheus, with his gift of foresight, could see the future, and what he saw in the depths beneath his peak terrified even him. He knew that the other prisoners, the ones sealed deeper and more securely, would one day attempt to break free, and his presence, his eternal vigilance, was part of the containment. The eagle was not there to torment him, it was there to keep him awake, to ensure that he never slept, never let his guard drop. For if Prometheus slept, if his foresight lapsed even for a moment, the others might seize that instant to begin their ascent. And so Prometheus endured, not as a martyr, but as a warden, a guardian of a prison built to hold the uncontainable.
But there is a fourth prisoner, one whose name has been so completely erased from the records that even scholars who spend their lives studying the ancient texts have never heard of him. The locals, the mountain peoples who have lived here since time immemorial, they know him by a different name. They call him the sleeper, the dreamer, the one beneath. He has no form in the myths because he predates even the concept of form. He is said to be the first of the Protogenoi, older even than chaos, a being that existed before existence itself learned how to exist. He is the void that dreamed the universe into being, and when the universe became real, he became trapped in his own dream, unable to wake, unable to die. The other Titans, even in their power, are children compared to him. And when they were defeated, when the Olympians sought a place to imprison them, they chose the Caucasus not for its remoteness, but because he was already here, sleeping beneath the stone. They knew that his presence, his sheer weight in reality, would create a kind of metaphysical gravity, a pull so strong that nothing, not even a Titan, could escape it. He is the anchor, the foundation of the prison, and he dreams still. His dreams are so vast, so incomprehensible, that they leak out into the world above. They become myths, legends, the strange visions that prophets see when they climb too high into the mountains and breathe the thin, cold air. Every story ever told about gods and monsters, every apocalyptic vision, every nightmare of the end of the world is a fragment of his dream. The people of the Caucasus say that when he finally wakes, if he ever wakes, the world will end. Not through fire or flood, but through unbecoming. Reality will remember that it was only ever a dream, and it will dissolve back into the void from which it came. These are the prisoners, the forgotten Titans of the Caucasus. And they have been here, buried beneath countless tons of stone and ice for an age so vast that the human mind cannot encompass it. Empires have risen and fallen in the world above. Languages have been born and died. Mountains have eroded to dust, and new mountains have risen in their place. And still, they remain, waiting, dreaming, straining against their bonds. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Caucasus have lived in the shadow of the prison. They did not know, in any explicit, articulated way, exactly what lay beneath the mountains. But they knew, in the way that a child knows there is something in the dark basement, that the earth beneath their feet was not entirely their own. They knew that there were rules, old rules, rules that had been passed down through so many generations that their origins were lost, but which had to be obeyed. You did not build on certain ground. You did not dig too deep in certain places. You did not, under any circumstances, enter the caves that opened like wounds in the mountainside and breathed cold air even in the height of summer. The shamans and the priests of the old pre-Christian religions understood this most clearly. In Georgia, in Armenia, in Chechnya and Dagestan and Ossetia, in all the 100 small kingdoms and tribes that made the Caucasus their home, there were always those who knew. They performed rituals on the high peaks, offerings of blood and grain and sacred fire, not to appease the gods of Olympus, who were foreign to them, but to maintain what they called the seal. They understood, in a way that the Greeks and Romans who wrote down the myths never did, that the Titans were not safely imprisoned in some distant mythological underworld. They were here, directly beneath the villages and the pastures and the sacred groves, and the seal, the complex web of magic and stone and ancient will that kept them contained, was not eternal. It required maintenance. It required belief. It required sacrifice. The rituals were not written down. They could not be. To write them would be to create a record, and a record could be stolen, studied, broken, and so they were passed from master to apprentice in unbroken lines, spoken in languages so old that they were intelligible even to the common people of the tribes. The rituals involved the precise placing of standing stones on the peaks, aligned with the stars in configurations that modern archaeology cannot explain. They involved the singing of certain notes, certain harmonies that resonated with the structure of the mountain itself, reinforcing the bonds. And they involved, on certain nights of the year when the boundary between the worlds grew thin, the offering of a life. Not human, not always, but something that breathed, something that had a soul. The blood would be poured into the sacred cracks, the fissures in the stone, and the priests would listen. If the mountain was silent, the seal was holding. But if there was an answer, a rumble, a tremor, a sound like distant thunder from far below, then the priests knew. Something was stirring. Something was testing its chains, and the rituals would have to be performed again, stronger, with greater offerings, with more power. This continued for millennia. Through the rise of the Persian Empire and its fall, through the coming of Alexander the Great, who stood at the foot of the Caucasus and declared that he would march to the ends of the earth, unaware that he was standing on the lid of a cosmic prison. Through the Roman expansion and the Christian conversion and the Islamic conquests, the priests kept their vigil. They kept the faith, and the seal held. But then, slowly, the old ways began to fade. Christianity, with its single God and its saints, had no room in its cosmology for the old rituals. The priests were branded as pagans, their practices as devil worship. The secret groves were cut down to build churches. The standing stones were toppled or Christianized, carved with crosses and made into memorials for saints. The knowledge, the unbroken lines of transmission began to break. Some of the rituals were lost entirely. Others were performed in secret, half remembered, their meanings obscured. The priests died without passing on their full knowledge to the next generation. And the seal, inch by inch, year by year, began to weaken. And the prisoners began to dream.
At first, the signs were subtle, so subtle that they could be dismissed as coincidence, as the natural workings of a geologically active region. A shepherd on the slopes of Kazbek reported that his flock refused to graze in a particular meadow, a place where they had grazed contentedly for generations. The animals would approach the edge of the grass, then stop, ears back, eyes rolling in terror, and no amount of encouragement or force could make them take another step. When the shepherd investigated, he found nothing. No wolf tracks, no sign of disease, just an ordinary meadow, except that the grass, though green, had stopped growing. Every blade was the same height, frozen in a state of perpetual summer that did not change as the seasons turned. In a village in Dagestan, a well that had provided sweet, clean water for 300 years suddenly went dry. Not slowly, not with the gradual decline that might signal a shift in the water table, but overnight. One evening it was full, and the next morning it was empty, the stone sides perfectly dry, as if no water had ever touched them. When the villagers lowered a lamp on a rope to investigate, they found that the well was far deeper than they had believed. The rope ran out at 300 feet, and still the lamp had not reached the bottom. And from that lightless depth they heard something, a sound like breathing, slow, rhythmic, patient. They pulled up the lamp and sealed the well with stone. No one spoke of it. In the archives of the Russian Geological Survey, there are reports from the 1890s that have never been satisfactorily explained. A series of expeditions into the deeper caves of the Caucasus, part of the great 19th century drive to map and understand the natural world. The teams went in with the best equipment of the age, with ropes and lamps and notebooks to record their findings. Most returned with mundane results, maps of limestone formations and underground rivers. But 3 expeditions, all in the span of a single decade, vanished entirely. No bodies were ever found. No equipment was recovered. The caves they had entered were later explored by other teams who found nothing unusual. No crevasses to fall into, no sudden floods, just empty passages leading deeper into the mountain. And on the walls, in one of the chambers, scratched into the stone with something sharp, the final expedition had left a message. It was in French, the language of science at the time. It said only, "It is aware. Do not follow." The 20th century brought new kinds of disturbance. The Soviet Union, in its determination to conquer nature, to bend the physical world to the will of human industry, came to the Caucasus with drills and dynamite. They blasted tunnels for roads, carved away entire mountainsides for their precious ores, and drove mines deep into the earth in search of coal and copper and gold. The local people, those who still remembered the old stories, protested. They said it was forbidden, They said there were places that must not be touched, but the Soviet engineers, armed with dialectical materialism and 5-year plans, dismissed their fears as primitive superstition. The mountains, they declared, were a resource to be exploited. There was no magic, there were no gods, there was only geology.
And so they dug. In 1958, a mining operation in the northern Caucasus was driving a shaft into what they believed to be a rich vein of iron ore. At a depth of 2,000 meters, far deeper than any previous excavation in the region, the drill bit suddenly dropped. It had broken through into a void, a cavity in the rock that should not have existed at that depth. The engineers, excited by the possibility of a massive geode or an underground chamber filled with valuable minerals, widened the hole and sent a man down on a cable with a lamp and a camera. He descended for 20 minutes, the winch unreeling meter after meter of steel cable, far beyond the expected size of any natural cavity. And then the cable went slack. Not broken, not cut, just slack, as if the man had reached the bottom. They called to him on the radio. There was no answer. They waited. Still nothing. Finally, they began to haul up the cable. It came up easily, far too easily. When the end emerged from the hole, the harness was empty. The man was gone, but clipped to the harness, where he had placed it in his final moments, was the camera. A film was developed. Most of the images were what you would expect. Shots of the rock walls as he descended, the circle of light growing smaller above him. But the final photograph, the last one he took before he vanished, showed something else. It was blurred, taken in haste or in terror, but the image is unmistakable. It shows a wall, not a wall of rock, but a wall of something smooth, something worked, something carved. And on that wall, covering every inch of the visible surface, were chains. Massive chains, each link as thick as a man's body, forged from a dark metal that seemed to absorb the light of the lamp. The chains ran down into the darkness below and up into the stone above, and they were all drawn tight, as if bearing an unimaginable weight. The photograph was classified immediately. The mine was sealed with concrete and officially declared unsafe due to toxic gas. The engineers were transferred to other projects and sworn to secrecy. But the photograph survived, buried in an archive, waiting for a researcher decades later to stumble upon it and wonder. The end of the Soviet Union brought a different kind of chaos to the Caucasus. The collapse of central authority, the wars and conflicts that erupted across the region, the displacement of populations. In the confusion, many things were forgotten. Border posts were abandoned, military installations fell into ruin, and deep in the mountains, in places that had been strictly off-limits for decades, people began to wander freely once more. And they found things. A group of shepherds, fleeing the fighting in Chechnya in 1994, took refuge in a cave system they had never entered before. Searching for a place to spend the night, they followed a passage that sloped gently downward for what felt like miles. The air grew warmer as they descended, which should have been impossible. And then they came to a door. Not a natural formation, not a boulder blocking the passage, but a door. It was made of bronze, green with age, and it was covered in writing. Not Georgian, not Armenian, not any of the scripts of the region. Something older. The writing seemed to move in the flickering light of their fire, the characters writhing like living things. One of the shepherds, braver or more foolish than the others, approached the door. He placed his hand on the bronze to push it open, and the door was warm. Warm, like living flesh. The metal pulsed beneath his palm. a slow, steady rhythm, a heartbeat. The shepherds fled. They emerged from the cave 3 days later, half mad with thirst and terror, and told their story to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed it as the hallucinations of desperate, frightened men. But an old woman in the village, one of the last who still knew the old prayers, heard the story and wept. She said the door should never have been found. It was one of the inner seals, placed there in the days before history. And if they had opened it, if they had gone through, the world would have ended that very night. But the most disturbing signs were not the ones that occurred on the earth. They were the ones that occurred in the mind. In the past 50 years, there has been a statistically significant increase in reports of strange dreams among the population of the Caucasus region. These are not ordinary nightmares. They share common elements across hundreds, perhaps thousands of individual accounts. The dreamers report standing on a dark plain under a starless sky. In the distance, they see mountains, but the mountains are inverted, hanging downward like stalactites, their peaks pointing into an abyss. And from that abyss, something is climbing. They never see it clearly. It is too large, too complex, too alien for the human mind to process. But they feel its attention. They know that it sees them. And they know, with a certainty that transcends logic, that it is coming. They wake in a state of profound existential dread, a feeling that persists for days or weeks. Many report a sense that the world around them is not quite real, that it is a thin film stretched over something vast and terrible. Psychologists have attempted to explain these dreams as a manifestation of collective trauma, the result of living in a region that has seen so much violence and upheaval. But the dreams predate the modern conflicts. They have been reported for over a century, and they are becoming more frequent, more vivid, more urgent. In the year 2002, a team of American geologists was granted permission to conduct a seismic survey of the Central Caucasus. They were studying the region's earthquake risk, using sound waves to map the structure of the rock deep beneath the surface. The survey was routine, uncontroversial. They set off a series of small, controlled explosions and recorded the echoes as they bounced off the layers of stone below. But when they analyzed the data, they found an anomaly. At a depth of approximately 7 kilometers, there was a void, a massive void, a cavity so large that it seemed to encompass the entire volume beneath the mountain range. The shape was wrong. Natural caves, no matter how large, have irregular boundaries, the result of water erosion and geological stress. But this cavity was regular. It was a sphere, a perfect sphere, 7 kilometers in diameter, suspended in the solid rock as if it had been carved there with intent. The lead geologist checked and rechecked the data. It was consistent across all their sensors. The void was real. But it made no geological sense. And then, as they were preparing their report, something stranger emerged from the data. The sphere was not empty. There was something inside it. The seismic readings showed a mass, a dense concentration of matter at the very center of the void, suspended in space. And that mass was vibrating, not randomly, but at a regular frequency. It was producing a sound, too low for human ears to hear, but there nonetheless. A hum. A note that had been singing in the heart of the mountain for longer than human civilization had existed. The team prepared to publish their findings, but before they could, they received a visit from representatives of the Russian government. The data, they were told, was classified for reasons of national security.
The findings were not to be published. The escorted was out of the country within 48 hours. The official explanation was that the survey had inadvertently mapped a secret military installation. But one of the geologists, years later, speaking anonymously, said that was a lie. He said that when the government officials saw the data, saw the image of that perfect sphere and the thing suspended at its center, they went pale. One of them, an older man with a heavy accent, had crossed himself and whispered a single word in Russian: Skulvani, the chained one.
And then, in the year 2019, something changed. On the night of October 31st, a date that the ancient Celts called Samhain, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest, seismographs across the Caucasus region registered an event. It was not an earthquake. Earthquakes have a specific signature, a sudden release of energy followed by diminishing aftershocks. This was different. It was a pulse, a single, deep, powerful pulse that originated from a point directly beneath Mount Elbrus and radiated outward in all directions. It lasted for exactly 7 seconds, and then it stopped. The magnitude was not large enough to cause damage, not large enough for most people to even feel it, but every scientific instrument in the region recorded it. And when seismologists analyzed the waveform, they found something impossible. The pulse was not random. It was structured. It had a rhythm. It was a pattern. Some called it a signal. Others, more poetically and perhaps more accurately, called it a knock. Something, deep beneath the ice and stone, had struck its prison wall. Once, deliberately. A test of the strength of its chains. An announcement. I am here. I am awake. And I am coming. The question that now haunts every scholar who knows these stories, every researcher who has glimpsed the classified files, every elder in the mountain villages who still remembers the old prayers, is simple and terrible. How long until the seal breaks? The ancient texts are maddeningly vague on this point. The Titans, they say, are imprisoned until the end of days, a phrase that sounds eternal, but may simply mean until the current cosmic order comes to an end. Other sources are more specific and more disturbing. They speak of the Titans' prison lasting as long as humanity remembers. This suggests that the seal is not merely physical, it is mimetic. It exists as much in the collective consciousness of our species as it does in the stone and ice. The rituals, the prayers, the stories passed down through generations, these were not just cultural traditions. They were acts of reinforcement, threads in a vast web of belief that held the Titans in place. And as those traditions die, as the stories are forgotten, as the modern world dismisses the old ways as primitive superstition, the web weakens, thread by thread, generation by generation. There are those who have dedicated their lives to understanding this. They are not academics with tenure at prestigious universities. They are not government officials with security clearances. They are the heirs of the old priesthoods, the last of the lineages scattered across the Caucasus and the wider world. They meet in secret, share their knowledge in whispers,
and work tirelessly to maintain what fragments of the seal remain. They have a name for themselves, a name in a language that has no written form. Roughly translated, it means the watchers of the threshold. They are few, and they are old, and they are losing.
One of them, a woman in her 80s who lives in a small village in the foothills of the Georgian Caucasus, agreed to speak, though she would not give her name. She said that her grandmother had taught her the prayers, as her grandmother's grandmother had taught her. The prayers were in a tongue that even she did not fully understand, but she could feel their power. She said that she still performs the rituals, alone now, on the appointed nights. She climbs to a certain place on the mountain, a flat stone that has been used for this purpose for thousands of years, and she sings. She can feel the mountain listening. She can feel the seal responding, tightening, holding. But it grows harder each year. The weight beneath is increasing. The pressure is building. She said that in her dreams she sees the Titans. She sees Atlas, his body a living mountain, his eyes open and full of an ancient, patient rage. She sees Typhon, coiled in his chasm of ice, his 100 heads dreaming of the sky. She sees the sleeper, and when she sees him, she cannot describe what he looks like, only that beholding him fills her with a terror so profound that she wakes screaming. And she sees the chains, vast chains that have held for millennia, forged by gods whose names are forgotten. And every time she dreams, there are fewer chains. They are breaking, one by one, slowly but inevitably. She was asked what would happen when they all break. She did not answer for a long time, and then she said simply, "The world will remember what it has forgotten, and it will wish it had not." But there is another possibility, one that the watchers do not speak of because it is too terrible and because it may not be true. It is whispered in the very oldest fragments of text, the ones that were ancient when the Greeks were young. They say that the Titans were not imprisoned to protect the world from them. They were imprisoned to protect them from us. That Zeus and the Olympians understood something that has since been forgotten, that the Titans, for all their power, for all their cosmic scale, were not evil. They were simply of a different order, a different age. They were the forces of raw creation, the powers that shaped the universe before there were laws to govern it. And in the new world, the world of law and civilization and human ambition, there was no place for them. They would be destroyed, not by the gods, but by us, by our industry, our science, our relentless drive to explain, to categorize, to control. The prison was not a punishment, it was a sanctuary, a place where the old powers could sleep undisturbed while the new age unfolded above them. And the seal was not just a chain to bind them, it was a warning to us. Do not dig too deep. Do not ask too many questions. Do not wake what sleeps. Because if you do, if you drag them into the light of your rational, ordered world, they will die. And their death will be the death of magic itself. The universe will become a cold, mechanical place, devoid of mystery, devoid of wonder, a clockwork cosmos where every question has an answer and every answer is empty. This is the nightmare that haunts the watchers more than any fear of destruction. The possibility that the breaking of the seal will not unleash the Titans upon the world, but will expose them to it. And that in that exposure, in that final confrontation between the old ways and the new, we will not lose. We will win. And our victory will be the saddest, most Pyrrhic victory in the history of existence.
But there is a third possibility. one that is older and stranger than either salvation or doom. It is found not in the Greek texts, but in the oral traditions of the mountain peoples, in the songs that grandmothers sing to children, in the stories told around the fire when the wind howls and the snow falls and the world outside is dark and cold. They say that the Titans are not waiting to escape. They are waiting to be remembered. That the prison was not built by Zeus at all. It was built by the Titans themselves. A voluntary exile, a withdrawal from a world that had moved on without them. They understood that the age of the Olympians would come, and after it the age of men, and that each age would bring its own gods, its own stories, its own truths. And rather than fight, rather than cling to power they no longer deserved, they chose to step aside, to go beneath, to sleep. But they left a door, a way back, not a physical door, but a metaphysical one, a door that opens not when the seal breaks, but when humanity chooses to open it. When we remember that before there were gods who demanded worship, there were powers that simply were. When we remember that the world is not just the surface we walk upon, but the depths beneath, the heights above, the vast and terrible and beautiful complexity of existence in all its forms. The Titans are not prisoners. They are seeds, buried in the dark earth of the Caucasus, waiting for the season to change, waiting for the world to be ready for them once more. And when that day comes, if it ever comes, they will not rise in wrath. They will rise in wonder. And they will teach us, as they taught the first humans who looked up at the stars and asked why, that the universe is not a thing to be conquered or understood, but a mystery to be lived. The shepherds who walk the high meadows still avoid certain places. The caves still breathe their cold air. The dreams still come. And deep beneath the twin peaks of Elbrus, beneath the weight of ice and stone and ages, something vast and patient continues its slow count of the years. The chains hold, for now. But in the mountains, the old woman still climbs to her stone on the appointed nights. She still sings the prayers and the forgotten tongue, not because she believes they will hold forever, but because, she says, someone must bear witness, someone must remember. And when the last of the watchers is gone, when the final prayer is sung and the final ritual forgotten, when the seal finally, inevitably breaks, the Titans will rise into a world that has no memory of them. And perhaps in that moment, we will finally understand what we lost when we buried the gods beneath the mountains. Not our fear, but our awe. And so the mountains stand, silent, eternal, keeping their secrets. The snow falls on Elbrus, the rivers flow, the eagles circle, and beneath it all, in chambers of stone that have never known light, the first children of creation dream their slow, patient dreams. They are not gone. They have never been gone. They are the foundation upon which everything else is built, the forgotten Titans, the sleepers beneath, the ones who wait. And they will wait as long as it takes, because for beings who were born before time itself, who have watched stars ignite and die, who have seen the universe in its infancy and will see it in its senescence, what is another age? What is another millennium? They have all the time in the world, because they are time. They are the world. They are the forgotten memory of what we once were and what we might yet become. The secret that the mountains keep, the truth that sleeps beneath the stone. And when you stand in the shadow of the Caucasus, if you are quiet, if you listen, you can hear it. A sound like distant thunder, a rhythm like a heartbeat, the breath of giants, the song of the deep, the voice of the first and the last, whispering from the abyss, "We are here. We have always been here, and we will be here long after you are dust."